Okay, I think we can get started. Good afternoon and welcome everyone from Manila to today's inaugural Build Back Better Sector Dialogue. I'm Belinda Hewitt. I'm a Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist with ADB, and it's a real pleasure to moderate today's session. So, the Asian Development Bank is really delighted to launch this webinar series. It's actually anchored in our recently published Build Back Better sector guides. These guides are intended to provide very practical resources to support our clients, partners, and our own staff to enhance the climate and disaster resilience of communities, infrastructure, and wider systems through effective post-disaster assistance. So please check out that link in the chat for those resources. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce the house rules for today. So firstly, your microphone will remain muted unless you're invited to speak. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom. It's along the bottom if you'd like to ask a question. So I'll pick up the questions and direct them to the speakers towards the end of the session. And today's session will be recorded and shared on the event website. So I'd like to initiate by handing over to Alexandra Galperin, who is the Head of Disaster Risk Management at ADB, to provide some opening remarks. So Alexandra has over 30 years of experience in analytics, policy advisory and capacity building in the field of disaster risk management and post-disaster operations. Over to you, Alex. Oh, I think we're just on mute. Sorry, Alex.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Belle, for the nice introduction. Very warm welcome to all the participants, to our partners and clients, ADB colleagues, and of course, the panelists. Thanks for joining today so shortly before the holidays. It's a real pleasure to give these welcoming remarks for the first session of the Build Back Better sector dialogues. So with this series of interactive webinars, we aim to share some of the critical regional voices and lessons learned in enhancing disaster and climate resilience through better and resilient post-disaster recovery. We are following very closely in this series the ADB's newly launched Build Back Better sector guides, actually just launched in October. And these 6 guides aim to support both ADB and our DMC counterparts to enhance the climate and disaster resilience of DMC communities, infrastructure and systems through effective and well-designed post-disaster assistance. In this first seminar, we're actually focusing on the first very critical volume, which lays out the fundamental principles and the cross-cutting measures that are relevant in any major post-disaster recovery and reconstruction situation, and also applying to less severe disaster impact situations. This will be followed by further webinars on transport, power, water, hygiene and sanitation, social infrastructure and irrigated agriculture sectors. A few words on disaster risk management and building back better in ADB. So as Asian Pacific's climate bank, ADB sees disaster risk management as a critical component of achieving better disaster and climate resilience. And this is captured in our key policy planning and planning documents. So firstly, in 2021, ADB approved its new disaster and emergency assistance policy. And there's a very important kind of shift here to realizing the primacy of risk reduction in everything that we do through risk-informed development, but also a recognition that risks will remain. It's impossible to reduce all risks. And so there's a continued importance of disaster preparedness, disaster risk financing, and resilient recovery and reconstruction to round this up. Now, in the Disaster Risk Management Action Plan that we just approved this year, we translated this policy into 4 work streams. So the first one is applying to all work streams, actually. It's the foundation, and that is improved disaster risk knowledge and risk-informed planning tools, increasing investments in disaster risk reductions, increasing investments in disaster preparedness, and mainstreaming disaster risk financing into resilient development and recovery actions, and highly relevant to today's sessions, promoting effective post-disaster recovery instruments. But also we set ourselves to work with DMCs to improve existing policies and frameworks and capacity for managing and coordinating a resilient recovery. So recovery and reconstruction provides, and this has been, the narrative for a long time, a critical window to apply and promote risk reduction principles to not only to building back better, but also making the linkage to development. The primary objective is you want to avoid reconfiguring the vulnerable conditions that led to the disaster in the first place. So in ADB, we are committed to keeping this momentum of this dialogue and the professional dedication to building back better alive as we're heading into a century or into the next decades where we're seeing increasing frequency and severity of certain types of disasters. So we use Build Back Better almost casually these days. And we all have more or less an understanding or idea what it means. I like to set the scene a little by going back 20 years and reflecting on the history of the concept, which really was first used right after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. I think it's just worth remembering that almost total destruction of coastal towns and villages around the Indian Ocean basin in 2004 to understand why this Build Back Better became almost a rallying cry and the guiding objective for reconstruction in Indonesia, Aceh and Nias in particular, Sri Lanka, Thailand, India, and other places. The question that was really passionately discussed at the time by governments, international agencies, and CSOs was quite simply, could you rebuild in the same highly exposed, low-lying areas that had been totally devastated? And if you did, what would that reconstruction need to look like? So one of the key issues was, for instance, addressing land ownership and land use. It became very essential and central questions, and more so than in previous large-scale disasters. So communal land ownership and land use mapping was one of the first things that were tackled and quite comprehensively in Indonesia. Rather than simply restoring physical infrastructure, Build Back Better called for risk assessments to fully capture risks, and this was applied, for defining, integrating risk reduction measures, enhancing community preparedness, and also addressing some of the social factors, including gender, and also environmental factors that had contributed to vulnerability in the first place. Since then, the concept has been widely adopted in disaster recovery frameworks around the world and undergone further development. For one, the disaster risk management community has shifted to a more holistic approach, which seeks to embed resilient recovery with longer-term resilient development planning. This is an area where we are increasingly supporting developing member countries by providing upstream support for risk assessment and resilient sector development plans, which then can also provide a critical roadmap in the aftermath of a disaster. Additionally, we've had quite a significant learning curve in achieving resilient recovery in the context of recent complex, compounded, and protracted disasters, including COVID-19 pandemic. As a community, we've also made further progress towards placing people at the center of Build Back Better reconstruction programming and balancing short-term needs with longer-term outcomes. These messages and many more will be highlighted today and in the coming series of events. So I hope you enjoyed today's sessions, and I'm very pleased to hand over to the panelists and the discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Great. So with the scene set, we'd like to start actually by getting to know a little bit more about you. So let's start with a very quick audience poll. And we'd like you to answer the question, which of these areas of disaster risk management are you most involved in? And you can see these actually relate to the 4 areas Alex described in ADB's Disaster Risk Management Action Plan. So please select one answer, maybe the best fit for you. We have some coming in already. That's great. Give it a minute or so. So they are disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, along with disaster risk financing as part of that preparedness, relief, recovery and reconstruction, and then risk analytics. Okay, let's have a peek at those results. So those are actually fairly even. So we have a larger proportion from disaster risk reduction. That's a very broad field, so that makes sense. And then we have actually a relatively even split across the 4. So that's fantastic. And I really hope that all of you will be able to share your expertise in those areas once it comes to the discussion today. So now I'd like to move along by introducing our next speaker, Dr. Paul Venton, a disaster resilience specialist, as well as co-author for the Build Back Better Sector Guide, Volume 1. Now, Paul specialises in strengthening people's disaster and climate resilience. He has 24 years of international experience and a PhD in improving the sustainability and scale of community-based disaster risk management. He also co-designed and teaches a course on emergency response, disasters and public health at Harvard University as part of a Master of Public Health degree. So Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you.
That's great. I love how you pronounce my name with the Australian accent. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. So I was very pleased to be part of the team involved in developing these guidelines, and I'm happy to be with you today. I'm joining you from Boston. In a moment, I'll briefly outline some of the principles and cross-cutting measures that are included in the guide. But first, I think it's important to just pause briefly and just take note of what disasters signify. In my view, through the damages and the losses inflicted in disasters, they reveal these pre-existing weaknesses. So moving forward, for the situation to improve in the future, a response must catalyze action to treat these weaknesses with renewed determination to avoid repeats. But the process must go further still to build resilience in the face of a complex future risk landscape, accounting for factors such as climate change, biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, population growth and trends such as unplanned urbanization, changing public health, food and water security risks, the intertwined systems and dependency relationships that exist, and all of this with respect to the implications that they have regarding social inequities. So instead of attempts to rebuild normality and thus recreate risk, ambitious recovery processes are vital, and Building Back Better is the opportunity to do just that. To overcome the complex underlying drivers that create conditions ripe for disaster, Building Back Better requires the thoughtful integration of both non-structural and structural measures based upon local realities. In other words, Building Back Better is as much a social process as a technical one. It's as much about soft measures as well as the hard engineering ones. And this Volume 1 guidelines, they outline these various cross-cutting principles and measures that are relevant across the different sector-specific recovery and rehabilitation investments that are the focus of the other sector guides. So I'm quickly just going to go through, first of all, the principles and then the cross-cutting measures themselves. The guide refers to 7 principles. The first one I've already really referred to. It's the principle of risk reduction. The aim of recovery is not replacing what was lost and rebuilding risk in the process of doing so, but reducing risk in support of a sustainable and resilient future in a changing world. The second principle is about capacity development. By definition, I think we'd agree that disasters overwhelm local capacity. So without local capacity strengthening, what hope is there for sustainable outcomes where communities and countries lead their resilience building pathways to avoid future disaster impacts? In this sense, external actors perform more of a support service as required. This leads to the third principle on local leadership. In light of complex conditions, externally generated solutions will inevitably be at risk of underperforming in terms of desired beneficial outcomes. Local engagement and leadership in decision-making will help ensure recovery processes are suitable and sustainable. So true partnership among stakeholders is crucial. And this then flows to the fourth principle on inclusion and equity. A disaster reveals not only damage to infrastructure, but also who was worse affected, particular groups of people. So building back better demands that any societal inequities leading to heightened risk and impacts in disaster aren't ignored, but are treated through the recovery process to avoid unjust repeats. There are other principles, but in the interests of time, I'll just mention them. And of course, you can refer to them and get more detail in the guides itself. But the other principles refer to quality, innovation and technology, and scalability. Turning attention now to the cross-cutting measures themselves. Maybe we could just pull up that slide again, Mish. That would be helpful, please. So underpinned by these principles are various cross-cutting soft measures that help ensure that recovery is best able to help affected communities and countries reach improved, sustainable and resilient futures. The guide refers to 10 such cross-cutting measures. The first is institutional resilience building and governance arrangements. Thanks very much. Because the drivers of disaster and vulnerability are multifaceted, disaster risk reduction is an all hands on deck, comprehensive process of engagement among stakeholders across sectors, across levels of governance, and involving principles of inclusion and so on. It demands partnership in decision making facilitated by strong leadership. In other words, good governance. So in the aftermath of the disaster, we can look, how was that response managed? Where were there gaps in decision-making leading to losses, and why? Strengthening governance for risk-informed sustainable goals moving forward is going to be vital. The second area, and Alexandra mentioned this just now, risk assessment. Building back better must equate with improved resilience, not just to a repeat of a similar event, but to the full risk context. Building on existing knowledge, recovery planning must incorporate the challenges that lie ahead. Many very sophisticated tools exist, including remote sensing, even artificial intelligence now, and I could refer you to box 3 in the guides for some fascinating examples on these. But again, it's imperative to blend different knowledge sources, and this would include indigenous knowledge as well as the technical and scientific, as this is a foundation for achieving beneficial outcomes in reality, in practice. The third area, early warning systems. How did the early warning system perform, and what could be improved? Often we find that weaknesses tend to be in the last mile, how the user communities receive this information and then are equipped to act, and benefits are derived through those actions. Last week, there was a tsunami alert off of the coast of California. Right now, thankfully, it was a false alarm, but right now an after-action review is underway to find out how people responded to the warning of that tsunami. The fourth area, again, already mentioned by Alexandra, land use planning. The risk assessment process mentioned could have implications for suitable land use. For example, we have lost a very high proportion of our wetlands, and we're paying the price through disaster. This feeds through to the next one, integrated flood risk management. All too familiar issues of flooding in the region and globally. Many of these issues are at play, I think will be discussed shortly by our colleagues in Pakistan concerning the major flood disaster in 2022. So I'll just pass over that one for now. Similarly, the next one is on standards for resilient building and infrastructure. So this is about improving performance-based standards and their enforcement in practice. And I'm assuming that many on this webinar will be experts in this field. The final set of measures, I think all have a strong local basis to them. The seventh one is on capacity development in relation to resilient buildings and infrastructure. Recovery plans and processes must aim to assist local populations in their recovery. This means their involvement in reconstruction. If livelihoods are lost or disrupted through disaster, opportunities to work on rebuilding could be a life support. I understand that in Asia, it's only about 10 to 15% of houses that are rebuilt after disaster are designed and constructed by professional builders. Practical skills training for homeowners on a safe and affordable construction would be a remarkable investment in future resilience. And indeed, I believe that over 460,000 safe houses were built this way in response to the Kashmir earthquake in Pakistan. The eighth cross-cutting measure in the guide is on strengthening local community social systems. Too often, aid interventions disregard social systems and undermine social capital just when people need support the most to restore their lives. We must work with formal and informal local leadership to ensure no unintended damage is done to the social recovery process that's been affected through a disaster event. Shock responsive social protection is our ninth cross-cutting measure. This is about expanding existing social protection in the event of a disaster for quick and efficient injection of inputs to avert deepened losses, negative coping mechanisms, and speed recovery. And this has been shown to be very effective in some places. And the final area is on resilient livelihood recovery. Clearly, a lot of these are interconnected. The resilient livelihood recovery is important for the household, but it's also very important for the local economy too. This could require improving access to affordable financial services, income opportunities, livelihood inputs such as seeds for agriculture, the restoration of support amenities, and even support for the diversification of livelihoods themselves for improved resilience moving forward. So overall, with respect to these principles and cross-cutting measures, we can see that there's much at play. And it's clear that the principles and measures for building back better should not first be thought about and planned for in the aftermath of a disaster. Strengthening partnerships, engagement with formal and informal local leaders, assessing risks and adapting to changing conditions, and working towards a less vulnerable future must be integrated in all actions and at all times. After a disaster, though, there's a clear need and a renewed impetus to address these pre-existing weaknesses that have been exposed and thereby help avoid loss in the future. And these guidelines, I think, are a resource that support this goal. So I thank you very much for your time. I look forward to hearing from colleagues on their practical application of some of these principles and measures. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the overview. Very, very helpful, and also for all of your work on the guide. So now with these key themes in mind, we'd like to actually go into a very quick second audience poll. And this poll on which of those cross-cutting measures for building back better do you think are most important? I know you may think many are important, but just choose one, and we've merged some of those together. So please take your choice. We have institutional resilience and governance, risk assessment, early warning systems, land use planning, and building and infrastructure standards have been brought together. Capacity building on resilience, and then finally we've grouped those community level social and livelihoods initiatives together as an option. See, we have plenty of answers coming in. That's great. Just give it another 30 seconds. Okay, let's share those poll results. Great. So now you can see, actually, like the last poll, we had a very even split. Though slightly more votes for institutional resilience and governance, which we would expect to see, as well as land use planning and building and infrastructure standards, might reflect also the audience we have here today. Many of us working on infrastructure space. And I think what this reflects is really that they're all important, because we can see such an even emphasis across. Fantastic. So now moving along, the Build Back Better sector guides were actually informed by a review of lessons learned from over 20 years of ADB disaster and emergency assistance, among other sources such as international expert inputs and staff consultation. So with this in mind, I'd like to now introduce our case study speakers. So we've got two speakers today. Nathan Rive is a Principal Natural Resources and Agriculture Specialist at ADB, where he has worked on climate change policy, economics, and science for over 20 years. And he holds a PhD in environmental science and policy and MSc in environmental technology from Imperial College London. Joining Nathan, Shaukat Shafi is Senior Project Officer and Head of the Urban Water and Disaster Risk Management Unit in Pakistan Resident Mission of ADB. And Shaukat's worked with ADB for over 22 years and led projects in many sectors, including water, urban housing, transport, and disaster risk reduction, including extensive support for post-disaster assistance. Now, a reminder as we go, please post your questions for the speakers, including Paul, Nathan, and Shaukat, in the Q&A box, and we'll come to these after the case study. So over to you, Nathan and Shaukat. Thank you.
Thanks, Belle. And if we could request for Mitch to share our slides. So thanks very much again for the invitation to present. We will be talking today about the Pakistan flood disaster of 2022 as a broad case study covering, in a way, the end-to-end activities and the impact that this flood has had on the work we've been doing, the development of Pakistan, and likely future engagement of the development community, including ADB, on climate and disasters more broadly. Next slide, please. So for those who are less familiar or who need a refresh from the news 2 years ago, the 2022 flood disaster was the largest flood disaster in Pakistan's recorded history. While it was not the most fatal, it did have the largest number of damages and losses, as well as the largest calculation of reconstruction. And what was perhaps most remarkable beyond these impacts is the discussion and the discourse around climate change in this flood. And the dynamic of this flood was around a sort of updated or different monsoon trajectory, which focused the rains rather than the north, but rather in the south. And the extreme rainfall was from 500 to 700% higher than average during that monsoon season in Sindh and Baluchistan, which, as you can see in the map to the right, were by far the most impacted areas. Next slide. I think there was one prior to this. Yeah, thanks. So on the request of governments, ADB and the other donor agencies provided support for the preparation of the post-disaster needs assessment, which in this case was conducted across all provinces and sectors. And the approach taken was largely to obviously a collaborative approach with particular agencies taking up particular sectors, either on their request or competitive advantage. ADB's focus was on the infrastructure sectors and transport and energy and wash, but we also contributed as well to other sectors, including water resources, agriculture, and DRR. Next slide, please. Following the calculation of the damages and losses, which as mentioned, totaled above 30 billion, this led to a preparation of a resilient recovery framework, or as the government calls it, the 4RF framework, which frames and provides a trajectory of reconstruction over the short to long term. Again, similar to the PDNA, this was a collaborative effort of support from the development partners with agencies covering, focusing on particular priority sector areas. In the case of ADB, we again supported the physical infrastructure area in more detail. And this was just the preparation of this framework. This did not particularly dictate our areas of eventual support. Now, this takes us to about December 2022. And in January 2023, the government called a conference in Geneva, where they invited donors and sought pledges for the reconstruction support efforts. Next slide, please. At that conference, ADB supported and committed its assistance of 1.5 billion over the subsequent years, over a period of around 2 to 3 years. The first of these projects were so beyond it. So I should mention that the 3 million APDRF, which was mobilized immediately, but the first of the larger projects was approved by actually in December 2022, which is the Emergency Flood Assistance Project, totaling at the time of approval around 475, and then topped up further with subsequent additional financing. I'll mention this in more detail in the subsequent slides, but I would also like to highlight that, as you can see here, our support has ranged across a wide array of sectors across transport and energy and education, food security, housing, all of which have contributed to the achievement of the reconstruction effort in line with the 4RF framework. So there was a broader architecture and framework which guided our support as well as that of other donor agencies. And the Ministry of Planning has a monitoring platform and dashboard in which they use to monitor all these efforts on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So the EFAP project, as we call it, was approved in 2022, in fact, ahead of the Geneva conference, is a cross-sector reconstruction program which looked to pull in the priority requests from the PDNA and the 4RF framework, covering roads and bridges, irrigation, drainage, and flood risk management infrastructure, as well as rural livelihoods and agriculture across 3 provinces and at the federal level for the National Highway Association agency, rather. I want to mention this project in particular because we spent a significant portion of the time developing, as part of the project processing, a climate risk management framework. As some of you may know, under preparation of emergency assistance loans, we have very little time to conduct upstream feasibility study or detailed design. We have a very only several weeks time period for processing to take to the board. This means a lot of that work needs to be done during project processing, project implementation, and we needed to ensure that we built into the project design a Build Back Better framework. The climate risk management framework we developed was a two-stage process, which included a risk and opportunity screening of the potential long list, which were developed at the PDNA, during the PDNA, and then a more detailed climate risk assessment once the sub-projects had been selected and an iterative process was taken to develop the designs, perhaps some of which were already underway, as well as stress testing of those sub-projects that were in near design already. This means that we had a sort of fairly flexible framework for the varying levels of readiness, which was required, of course, because we had multiple sectors, multiple provinces, and not all provinces and sectors were at an equal level of readiness in terms of their selection or prioritization or the design. And this needed to be built into the framework. Next slide, please. So the broad guidelines for Build Back Better in this in the project as part of the risk framework were in three key areas. One is around the standard engineering considerations, looking to see what were no regrets options, thinking strategically around the sizing and capacity and actual design specifications of each of these sub projects. We also wanted to ensure that the sub-projects selected were integrated within a broader flood risk management thinking, ensuring that we thought that the design was considering not only of the particular asset, but also the broader area and community and system in which they existed. And finally, taking a very much a forward-looking climate adaptation approach, and this is, of course, considering the need for taking into account potential risks in future and the discussion at the time of the 2022 floods that much of this was driven by or exacerbated by climate itself. So we'd sought to avoid maladaptation, look to nature-based solutions where feasible, and take a longer-term view more broadly. Next slide, please. So in the actual implementation of this climate risk management framework, in this case, I'll talk to the irrigation and flood risk management infrastructure. This is the sector that I'm most familiar with. We broke down the sub-projects into three broad categories, and this was based on an upstream, say, stage 1 climate risk screening and assessment of that sub-project. Now, category 1 was for sub-projects where, following the assessment, it was deemed that the existing protection could be rebuilt, but with necessary design adjustments taking into account future climate change. So this is perhaps, for those familiar with ADB nomenclature, this is sort of type 1 adaptation, where we may adjust, say, the height or freeboard of particular sub-projects. Next slide, please. Category 2 was for sub-projects that required a little bit more advanced adaptation thinking, incorporation of additional design elements to the damaged infrastructure beyond those that were initially envisaged in the PDNA. So this may actually include relocation of infrastructure or activities, particularly where flood has eroded agricultural lands in the floodplains, and it appears that this dynamic would continue in future. Next slide, please. Category 3 was, of course, for the category of shortlisted or long-listed sub-projects, which were eventually dropped due to either a high risk of maladaptation or an assessment that the residual risks were too high to manage, and that the long-term economic viability and technical viability of the sub-project was not feasible to manage under this project. Next slide, please. So in terms of the early findings and recommendations, this project is actually currently underway. There were some key lessons, and of course lessons that were learned already in the early stages, that the speed of delivery of this climate risk management framework required, because of the requirements of additional work, it was necessary to actually start the work already during project processing. So we had mobilized consultants already at the time, even before board approval, to start assessing the long list sub-projects for their climate risks. And because of the capacity of the consulting industry in Pakistan, and of course the high demand of that industry at the time of the disaster, continuous supervision was required by ADB advisors or ADB staff themselves. There was significant constraints with regard to data, and it was a lot of consideration was required in terms of what sub-projects would be selected on the basis of either an assessment, geographical spread, competing political demands, etc. So there was a balanced approach required and not simply being dictated by the climate risk management. The long list of sub-projects was, of course, not, so the funding was rather the demands of funding from the long list of projects was larger than the project had budgeted for. This means that some projects could not be taken up. And in our experience, the longer the list of sub-projects, the better. This provided some flexibility in the prioritization of shortlisting and eventually design in the event that some results from the climate risk management deemed some projects less viable than others. And finally, given that there were some tough decisions that needed to be made around the prioritization, the use of GIS and modeling tools was effective not only for the assessment and design, but also for communication. Next slide, please. And I think at this point, I'll hand over to Shaukat to discuss his project.
Yes. Hello, everybody. This project is Sindh Housing, basically just sort of giving you a dimension of Sindh, which was the province most affected. So almost 70% of the province was submerged at some point. It has very mild slopes, so water got stuck, if you like, in large part of the areas. 24 of the 30 districts of Sindh were declared calamity hit. The population set that was severely affected, I would say, was around 12.4 million, although the initial numbers were much higher, but most of them could go back in very short time to their original locations. But this 12.4 million was the most affected population. The housing damage was about 2.1 million houses. Next slide, please. So I think this project pretty much in terms of its design embodies what Paul shared earlier. We basically, had to, go back to the drawing board after the PDNA, because the numbers that we calculated, even with, remote sensing and satellite imagery and whatnot, ground information, when we got into validation were very different from what we had at the PDNA stage. And then since we were supposed to support this particular housing program, we did a couple of rounds, if you like, in terms of collecting data on our clients. And that basically helped us design the program better, if you like. So, we looked at, all kind of vulnerabilities, woman-headed household, physically handicapped people. About 127 parameters were collected, on each household to understand how best we can serve them and how best we can design that program. So, this gives you, if you like, the highlights of that particular exercise. Next slide, please. So in terms of the program design, our focus was on housing. This was basically riding on some initial work that the World Bank had actually done. So they were already on ground in terms of this particular exercise. What we did was that we looked at, for example, the social infrastructure that they had built as part of their program, and looked at opportunities in terms of changing the structure of the program from just houses to housing. So we focused more on the community infrastructure part. How would we make these houses more livable, and how could we make communities more resilient? And how could we restore their livelihoods, for example. So, these are the three key outcomes that we are looking at. So housing, community infrastructure, and community resilience. Next slide, please. In terms of the size of the program, around 400 million, 40 million from the government on top, and some grant money. Next slide. Next slide, please. So basically, we currently, in terms of where this whole program is, it is supported by multiple donors, not just by us. So 2 million household information we have already validated. We have already opened bank accounts for 1 million people. Construction has started by more than 800,000 household already. So post plinth means they are already halfway through their construction, and 350,000 household are already completed as we speak. And that includes the whole program, not just our program. The larger approach around that program is community driven, Inst2 predominantly. So basically, there are 4 stages in which maybe next slide would give you a bit of flavor on that. Next slide, please. So basically, there are 4 stages through which payments are made. So the household construct their own houses. We have 5 large local community NGOs who already had a huge footprint in this area. They are the ones who are basically training the communities, validating these outputs. There's a very extensive real-time MIS system which is in place, on which data is uploaded. Every person receives their money through formal bank accounts. After there's an advance, and then every time they meet a certain benchmark, and these are the 4 benchmarks that you see. Plinth, lentil, and completion. They receive the rest of the money. So it's released in tranches, and there are multiple options that they can follow depending upon the topography that they are. So we tend to use a lot of local materials, and looking at the capacity of the communities, not to overstretch them, something which is within their means and technical capacity to undertake. Next slide, please. So again, in terms of the screening, there was, if you look at the red part, these were the houses which were within the floodplain and which got destroyed. So we are not constructing within the floodplain and offering land close to the floodplain, but outside the floodplain to the communities or the households that were living within the floodplain, because that we believe is a red zone, which means that they would get flooded very frequently, and the cost of constructing anything which is more resilient to that kind of flood would be inhibiting, if you like. So basically, the rest of the yellows that you see are being constructed again to a different standard. So plinth levels are raised. Again, a lot of people were living in mud houses, so temperature again becomes a huge issue. So in terms of adaptation, these are the 2 core things that we are looking at. One is temperature, the other is the plinth levels to make these houses more resilient. Earthquake risk is very limited, but long and the short, we are looking at multi-hazard resilience when it comes to construction of these houses. Next. So beyond this, we are also looking at land use. We are looking at, a lot of these houses were haphazard in terms of their previous footprint. The ownership, wherever they were sitting on government land, the government has agreed to give that land away to them. So we are sort of replanning these cities, since we are doing community infrastructure and other activities there. We are, looking at all aspects of, like, resilient construction. So we have, looking at, CBDRM, risk management, from future floods, looking at the environment, looking at where the waste would go, looking at the sewerage network, looking at energy, for example. So our project also provides, for example, solarization of individual household, and then basically looking at areas which can be, for example, greened, and looking at the overall well-being of the community. So these are the plans that we are developing for each of the community. Next, please. And also looking at the larger, if you like, the climate aspect, in terms of the location, the direction of the house, the wind direction, also in terms of green spaces, future expansion. So all these aspects are built into the overall design and planning of the projects that we are undertaking, or the villages in which we are undertaking these projects. Next slide. This again is looking beyond specific settlements in terms of the higher risk that they face from the ecosystem, or the space in which they are located. So we are also sort of constructing protection works outside the community. Next slide. In terms of the challenges and the lessons learned, when if you want to build back better, one of course is the larger issue of the extent of the disaster. It's always a moving target, and that has remained a huge challenge both during the PDNAs and even after, when you get into the design and the building phase, because I told you the number for Sindh housing was 1.4 million when we started the project, and it's fell to 2.1 million ultimately when we did the validation. So that's a huge issue, again, in terms of the geographic extent. The number of districts were added. Then basically, when you are working with such huge teams, such huge footprints, 12.4 million population is bigger than many countries of the world, maybe 40, 50 countries of the world. So if you are, dealing with such huge population, and if you have to move in such short times, and dealing with huge teams who do the validation and all that, again, huge issue is how do you collect data? How do you ensure consistency of data? So we had a very extensive effort. I think even just that effort took us almost 6 to 8 months, and to sort of clean up and to have more consistency and common understanding across definitions. Then again, the larger issue is that when disasters happen, there is a political economy of disasters also. There is a cannibalization of development budget. Sorry for using that word, but it's more in terms of the fact that uh, disaster monies are additional monies. They used to be additional monies, but not anymore. You have to basically create space for these monies within the current development budgets, current outlays. Even in our case, ADB only does not provide additionality anymore. It has to be adjusted within the existing headrooms. So you have to be very careful, because this is precious money, because it comes at the expense of other projects, if you like. And then I think what we found useful is triangulation of data, use of technology. Again, we used a lot of technology, but the technology cost really becomes very exorbitant if you want to have very accurate data. So, there is a limit to which you can sort of do it. Next slide. As Nathan mentioned, the processing time for previous slide. The processing time is very limited. 16 weeks. You similarly, you have very limited resource. So all of the work that you do during processing assumes there are concessions, but that basically means that you will have to basically do all these things after the effect, which means after the approval of the project. So there are the issue is that the timelines even for implementation are very limited. just maybe I'll just dwell on one point and I'll close here. So, one is that when you say build back better, I think the things have to move from build back better to build back smarter also. Because one is, disasters are like justice delayed is denied, speed is of essence. The other is that when you do, when you're reconstructing, there is in developing countries a huge development deficit also. So the thing is, if there is a road or if it's a school, if it already was undersized, would you build it to the same undersize or would you build it to the size that it requires? So I think this development deficit and then the speed at times requires you to look at different technology options because there's an economy around each of the infrastructure, whether it's a school, so there are students in that school already. So you cannot take the regular time that you do for any other infrastructure. Similarly, road, there's an economy around it. You can't take your own sweet time about it. So build back better. These are the compromises that you need to sort of understand when you are building back better. So I'll just stop here and maybe go with the question. Sorry about the extended time.
No, not at all. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Nathan and Shaukat. I think a really good, at least initial overview of what I imagine has been such a huge and complex series of efforts between ADB and development partners and, of course, Government of Pakistan. We do have a time for a couple of questions. If you'd like to post those in the chat, please do. I'll just start with one or two while we're seeing if there's any posted in the chat. Maybe just coming back to this this climate and disaster risk management framework, Nathan, that you introduced, which sounded like it was, really, really key to the process. And has this had an effect on the way that investments and development is being planned moving forward? Has it been helpful in mainstreaming that kind of risk management into the development process for future projects?
I guess there's a number of ways to answer that. I think firstly, more broadly, the disaster itself really changed the way development partners, the government, communities think about climate change more broadly, and really refocus the mind towards some key areas that were perhaps underappreciated or underattended in a sense, and that meant that projects that perhaps had not been prioritized earlier that would have been very beneficial for resilience were then brought back to the fore. And that is certainly reflected in ADB's pipeline and the pipeline of development partners. And that was actually one of our later slides, is that we very much reoriented our approach, both, and this is not going to be only reflected in our pipeline, but also in the upcoming CPS, the country partnership strategy, which already was oriented towards climate, but is going to be more heavily prioritized around climate change and resilience across all sectors, and not just the sort of typical sectors like urban and water.
Fantastic, thanks. So a question from the audience is, how has disaster risk insurance or financing been looked at post-disaster? Is that being revisited? So Pakistan team, if you have any views on that. Alex, maybe you have views also from broader ADB side.
Yeah, exactly. So insurance is something, and DRF, DRF and insurance more broadly is something that we have been looking at over several years. But again, as sort of as we refocus or reorient our pipeline and activities, there is much more attention and willingness for the government to pick these things up, and DRF more broadly for active active engagement. Some of you may be familiar with Pakistan, but those less so. The donor community has been discussing with the government for many years, and there seemed to be a lack of engagement. DRF seemed to be somewhat of an orphan topic, bouncing around between, say, Ministry of Finance and other ministries. But going forward, we have quite a bit of work on our side. Some of you may know we approved the Climate Disaster Resilience Enhancement Program, which is ADB's third climate-related PBL, policy-based loan, which includes a key reform area around disaster risk finance. And that, for our side, is going to anchor a lot of the work we're doing going forward. The CDREP itself includes a contingent disaster financing option element to it. It also includes elements around budget allocations and contingent budget allocations for climate and disaster. It also includes an element around risk transfer mechanisms. Those will be then taken forward in more detail with subsequent ADB engagement through a sector development program and insurance that's planned, agriculture insurance that we're looking to take up under several other projects. So more broadly, again, as mentioned, the disaster has cast a long shadow on a lot of what we're doing, and that includes on the work we're going to be doing much more on in DRF.
Thank you so much. Alex, anything you wanted to add on DRF generally? Or? Oh, you're on mute. No, but all good.
Yeah, no, I think Nathan's observations, I think it's a good example also of a government that has been working and thinking, and of course experienced a series of really devastating disaster events, being massively involved in these recovery processes. I think it really depends on the country, and I think we need, as ADB, in situations where there's maybe less awareness, also raise the issue of disaster risk financing as a component of post-disaster recovery planning discussions. I think also our work now in terms of recovery readiness, increasing recovery readiness, again, the fiscal side needs to be discussed. So I think there's plenty of opportunities. We see interest, right? But it's very uneven between countries, and disasters, I mean, for lack of a better word, present an opportunity to bring this on the table. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I just got one last question and then we'll wrap up due to time. Maybe you can all feed in on this, or Paul, you can start. This idea, and one of the questions was raised, of a resilience premium. So the additional cost of building back better. Do you have any views or experiences around this? Is there indeed a premium, or is it a false economy, not to invest? But maybe any general views from you, Paul, and I'll go to the others if you'd like.
Well, I begin by saying.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Who did you want to start, Belinda?
No, please, Paul, go ahead.
Well, very briefly, I'm not an economist, so I'm reading these, and I've been engaged sort of on the periphery of various studies. But I think that trying to get a sense of the costs of inaction, and when you see these significant events unfold and you see the scale of these numbers that are presented in terms of damages, and also the recovery, I'd be interested to know how people, like so many millions of people affected in the disaster, but for how many years after, what are the costs of that? It's very significant, clearly. So I think there's at a common sense level, there's a very strong sense that prevention is better than treatment after. But of course, that the devil's in the detail with respect to how that works out. But all of the work that I've seen has provided strong emphasis towards this. And I think what we're saying is that, yeah, in a disaster, there's so many more challenges to overcome. There's been damage, so the building back better is more of a challenge. This is an argument for disaster risk reduction being built into everyday activities as a matter of extreme urgency, especially led in with the climate crisis and other challenges that we face. And we can see economic arguments that support that in some settings, but I'll allow others to step in with some specific experience in that area.
Shaka,
Maybe
please go
just,
ahead.
yeah, just to comment it, in a sense, one aspect, of course, is that there are studies or estimates which people present. Dollar investment in resilience is worth 4 in reconstruction or whatever. And there are other numbers which put it to 1 to 7, but that's one side of the story. The other side is that when you talk about when an event happens, and since we are talking about building back better, the thumb rule or the averages that people actually built into reconstruction is about 10 to 15% extra cost of reconstruction to build back better, which is grossly inadequate. That's our experience. The cost of building back better is good about 50%, if not more, than the original infrastructure. And the reason being that at least if you look at, for example, our original estimates from the PDNA and the cost that we actually got, I think that's on average the additionality that we are getting. And the reason is that in most cases, when you're building back better, you're actually pretty much scrapping the original structure. For example, if I have to raise the plinth by 5 feet, actually, it's not building back better, it is sort of reconstruction, right? And large part is actually reconstruction. So I think that premium needs to be, or that thumb rule needs to be relooked at. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've reached 5 past, so I think we will wrap it up there. There's more questions in the chat, but perhaps we can come back to those, or our panelists can post directly there. So I'd just like to close by saying a huge thank you to everyone for joining today. It's been very rich conversation, and thank you especially to our speakers and presenters for sharing your lessons and your really substantive insights on these experiences. So the presentations and event recording will be uploaded to our Eventsia website. We'll post that in the chat here. So our next Build Back Better sector dialogue, focusing on the transport sector, will actually be held next Tuesday, 17th December at 11 a.m. Manila time. So I really hope you'll dial in for that. Please sign up via that website in the chat. We're excited to have another great lineup, and we'll be sharing the case study of the Palu Bay Port Master Plan and Reconstruction following the 2018 Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami. So please do sign up and share that. Thank you very much for participating, and good day to everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Actually,
Bye-bye.
this